It's a virtual countdown, see? Yes. It's virtual countdown 5, 4. So I'm listening. Please stand for Sir Rodney Williams, Governor General of Antigua and Barbuda, and Lady Williams. Please remain standing. Sir Rodney Williams, Governor General of Antigua and Barbuda, and Lady Williams. Leader of the Opposition, Honorable Jamal Pringle. Ambassador Dwight Gardner. Ministers of Government, Chair of Campus Council, Honorable Aziz Hadid. Professor Justin Robinson, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of the West Indies, Five Islands Campus. Dr. Camille Samuel, Campus Registrar of the University of the West Indies, Five Islands Campus. Distinguished speaker, Dr. Andrea Baldwin, Associate Professor, the University of Utah, directors and staff of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, deans, heads of departments, and representatives of the UWI, conference delegates, specially invited guests, live stream audience, ladies and gentlemen, we're in for a glorious evening. As you know, the Caribbean is a region of rhythm and tempo. It's also a region with great reflection. And so today we are going to try to combine these elements in order to make for a very memorable occasion. So first, a bit of housekeeping. Apologies for the late start. But the good news is that we have been assured that the delegation that is on its way will soon arrive here. And so there are more of you. In the Caribbean, we say small up yourself. But you don't have to small up yourself. There's enough seating. Those on live stream, we promise that we'll be able to, that we will allow for you to move around without missing anything that's going to occur here live. So, my task here, oh, by the way, I forgot the last time. I'm not going to forget this time. My name is Don Marshall. And I am your MC for the evening, but today I will also be joined by Dr. Daisy Leslie, who would also be part and parcel of sharing these duties with me. She will take you through the introduction of the guest speaker and the question and answer session. I also want to say a special shout out to the band Burning Flames. You're in the house, so let's give you a round of applause. Welcome. I see you there. They're in the second row, and they are, along with the Governor General, our dignitaries tonight. No offense, Principal and Registrar. I am going to invite you, Registrar, to come and share your welcoming remarks.
Please permit me to adopt the protocols as espoused by our MC. But I must acknowledge our Governor General, Sir Rodney Williams, Lady Williams, our Campus Council Chair, our Principal, all of you, our distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I feel like I am now in the way of an exciting evening. But nevertheless, let me welcome you again to our campus. For those of you who've been with us for the last day and a half, I am told that you've had a very exciting time, thrilling and engaging discussions, not so? And so this is what we've come to expect from SALISES, an understanding of great discourse, and discourse meant to change the world and change the realities within our Caribbean sphere. With my words of welcome, I say to you, having looked at our guest lecturer's bio, Dr. Baldwin's bio, and looking at her topic, I fully expect that she would walk us through some difficult terrain to do with power, society, culture, and history. And we are so very excited to hear all that you would bring to the table. This evening promises to be an exceptional one, with great discussions, great entertainment, welcome Burning Flames, and an understanding that together with bold ideas, we can imagine something different for us. We can imagine a future that is filled with our walk together, and togetherness is the key to changing the realities that we see today. For those of you who've not been with us and you're joining us for the first time, we welcome you to our beautiful campus, and we know that you're going to have a very great evening with us. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here with us. Engage, reflect, and allow those bold ideas to come to the fore so that together we can work hand in hand as we craft a different future for ourselves. Have a good one.
Thank you very much, Campus Registrar. We are now close to that time when we would have our featured speaker address us on the topic of reimagining Caribbean futures at a time of imposed epochal rupture. I am going to invite one of our distinguished scholars and academics in the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, the Mona campus. She's a senior fellow, Dr. Dacia Leslie. Please, she will introduce the speaker and take us through a significant part of this program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Don Marshall. Good evening, Governor General Williams, Lady Williams, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. The privilege is all mine to introduce our distinguished speaker of the 26th Annual SALISES Conference. So, Dr. Andrea Baldwin is an associate professor in the divisions of gender and ethnic studies, and she serves as the associate dean for research in the School for Cultural and Social Transformation at the University of Utah. An attorney at law, she holds a master's degree in international trade policy and a PhD in gender and development studies from the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Nita Borough, UWI Cave Hill, UWI Cave Hill. Dr. Baldwin is the founder of the Black Feminist Eco Lab at the University of Utah and the creator and co-host of Standpoints, a Black feminist podcast produced by Virginia Tech Publishing. Her scholarly work includes a 2021 book monograph, several co-edited volumes, and journal articles in Frontiers, Ouagadougou, Pito, the International Journal of Africana Studies, the Body Studies Journal, the Journal of International Women's Studies, and Theoretical Practice. Before joining the University of Utah, Dr. Baldwin worked with Invest Barbados, the delegation of the European Union to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean states, and Virginia Tech. Born and raised in Barbados, she proudly identifies as an all-around Caribbean woman with a deep love of soca music. Now, I invite everyone to just put your hands together and make Dr. Baldwin feel welcome. Welcome, Dr. Baldwin, our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Let me just put my glasses on. Sir Rodney Williams, Governor General of Antigua and Barbuda, and Lady Williams, Leader of the Opposition, Honorable Jamal Pringle, Ambassador Dwight Gardner, Ministers of Government, Chair of Campus Council, Honorable Aziz Hadid, Professor Justin Robinson, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal, the University of the West Indies Five Islands Campus, Dr. Camille Samuel, Campus Registrar, the University of the West Indies Five Island Campus, directors and staff of SALISES units, deans, head of departments, and representatives of the University of the West Indies, conference delegates, specially invited guests, live stream audience, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor this evening to deliver this year's Sir Arthur Lewis Distinguished Lecture at the 26th Annual SALISES Conference. I'm deeply grateful to be here at the Five Islands campus in beautiful Antigua. Okay. Just give me 1 second. Thank you. All right. I start with a few anecdotes. Last year, Hurricane Beryl, the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record, swept through the Caribbean. It was the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic's main development region. Before July, devastating Union Island, Mayro, and Canouan. My 5-year-old niece's father, a Barbadian fireman, was deployed to Union Island and described the scene as so barren, even grass was gone. The grade report estimated Grenada's economic damage at $218 million, about 16.5% of its 2023 GDP. But numbers can't capture the full loss, trauma, and displacement and grief. This year marks 5 years since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which triggered economic downturn across the region. According to a 2020 Inter-American Development Bank report, the pandemic intensified economic instability. And in countries like the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, and Suriname, for example, there were sharp declines in economic forecasts and worsening fiscal positions. The crisis also exposed the intensified social vulnerabilities, including a marked increase in gender-based violence during lockdown. In recent weeks, the Trump administration has dismantled USAID, a move that threatens to disrupt programs in the Caribbean. Simultaneously, the US on April 2nd implemented 10% tariffs on Caribbean exports to the US. The administration has also placed Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Lucia on a draft list of partial travel suspensions for failure to address unspecified deficiencies, invoking uncertainty and threatening mobility. Deportations of thousands of Caribbean nationals have already disrupted lives and weakened financial support systems, particularly through a loss of remittances. Taken together, the mounting climate disasters, global health emergencies, shrinking international aid, hostile immigration regimes, and economic volatility mark not isolated incidents, but a shared moment of rupture. Western nations are increasingly turning inward, defunding health infrastructure, and sidelining decades of climate science. The United States' withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization, alongside regressive appointments and mass firings at places like the CDC, are not anomalies. They're symptoms of a deeper unraveling. What we are seeing today is Western nations putting themselves first, but let's be honest, when have they not put themselves first? Western powers have always prioritized their own interests, and I ask, how did we arrive at this moment? Why should we understand these economic, ecological, and political crises as interconnected? What does this convergence demand of the Caribbean? And most critically, how might we respond? What new possibilities might we shape in this time? Sorry. In the spirit of Sir Arthur Lewis, who once said, "Sustainable development requires balancing economic, social, and environmental goals," this lecture urges us to foreground the environment alongside economic, social, and political structures as central to safeguarding our own collective future. As such, in delivering this lecture, I think not only with Lewis, but with Caribbean feminists like the Most Honorable Professor V. Eugene Barreto, Tracy Robinson, and Andrea. I begin by considering how the Caribbean has historically navigated periods of deep imposed disruption, what I refer to as epochal ruptures, rooted in Western expansion and domination. I recall 3 such ruptures over the region's history, each inflicting profound economic, social, cultural, and ecological harm, but each also met with creative and radical responses from Caribbean people. As Sir Arthur Lewis reminds us, it's not just about economic growth, but also about improving people's lives and expanding human capabilities and freedom. In each instance of rupture, I argue, Caribbean communities did more than survive. They forged new ways of being. They imagined alternative futures and acted toward them. I reflect on past ruptures and ask, what can they teach us about the present? At the core of this reflection is a call for an ethic of care, a vision of economies not limited to trade, GDP, or currency, but rooted in how we care for one another, for our communities, and for our environments. On this basis, I develop a model which I call brackish economies, a framework that builds on and expands the Lewis model, taking theoretical risk in the same spirit of experimentation that Lewis believed was necessary for meaningful change. Through each moment of rupture, Caribbean people have imagined and created new ways of being. And it is when we have creatively engaged each other ethically and with care, prioritizing building not through imposed systems, but through our own interdependent and evolving creativity, that we have thrived. Each rupture demonstrates the importance of understanding and prioritizing the interconnectivity of economic, social, cultural, and ecological havoc, as well as pushback. Our first rupture, as Edward Glissant and other Caribbean critical thinkers have discussed, was colonialism. This rupture has not only ushered in mass genocide, but also marked a violent severance of individuals from their homelands, cultures, and histories, creating an enduring and generative fracture in the fabric of human cultures and histories and human existence, one that continues to shape the Caribbean today. The Caribbean, in the words of Sylvia Wynter, is an archipelago of human otherness, a region designed to serve the interests of colonial powers, whose economic and political systems were built on the violent dispossession of others, legitimated through ideologies of primitivism, exoticism, and a hierarchical view of civilization. Colonial laws and ideologies imported patriarchal, homophobic, and racist systems that shaped not only the social structure, but the very essence of the life in the region. In this colonial project, land, like labor, was always a central resource to be extracted and commodified and exhausted for the benefit of European powers. The impact of colonialism created a foundation of ecological destruction in the Caribbean. Early sugar plantations were accompanied by extensive primary deforestation, and according to Maynard and Simpson, as early as 1663, Barbados was already described as decaying fast due to soil exhaustion. The land, which had been violently restructured to produce sugar and other crops for European profits, was ironically simultaneously rendered unsustainable by those same systems of extraction. This is the paradox at the heart of the Caribbean's economic history. It is a region of both immense wealth generation and profound ecological and social rupture. At its heart, this system was an uncaring system. Yet, despite this rupture, despite the violence, despite the dispossession, the Caribbean did not simply endure, it created. Enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples forged cooperative practices of survival. Cultural communities like the Garifuna, Maroons, and indentured laborers transformed suffering into solidarity, memory, and art. Rituals like Jose in Trinidad became multiracial acts of resistance and cultural expression. Organized labor movements in the 1930s, sparked by economic crises and colonial repression, became vehicles for anti-colonial struggle from British Guiana to Barbados. In examining this first rupture, I'm reminded of Glissant's work that identify the Caribbean as always in flux, shaped not only by loss, but by creative forces of survival. Caribbean people forged new worlds, languages, cuisines, religions, and kinships. The end of World War II marked a second major rupture for the Caribbean, the rise of a global economic order shaped by Bretton Woods institutions, Cold War geopolitics, and the formation of trade regimes like GATT, later the WTO. While many Caribbean nations gained political independence during this era, economic sovereignty remained out of reach. Facing oil shocks and structural vulnerabilities, countries turned to the IMF and the World Bank, which imposed a narrow capitalist path tied to austerity and dependency. In the face of these pressures, some Caribbean nations sought to chart alternative futures. The cooperation between Grenada, Cuba, and Jamaica during the 1970s and early 80s represented a bold attempt to imagine a different world order. Grenada, in particular, stood out as a radical reimagining of what the Caribbean could be at the time of the 1979 revolution. Grenada was grappling with high unemployment. The island's economy remained dependent on agricultural exports and lacked basic infrastructure. The People's Revolutionary Government advocated for a mixed economy, abolishing income tax for the poorest 30% of the population, implementing free medical and dental care, free school uniforms, books, expanded access to higher education, criminalized sexual exploitation in the workforce, and implemented equal pay legislation and maternity leave with job security. Grenada's Revolution Project also gestured toward ecological consciousness. The PRG developed sustainable agricultural initiatives aimed at improving food security, reducing dependence on imports, and protecting the island's natural resources. Resistance also took cultural and spiritual forms. Rastafari communities in Jamaica turned to organic farming and land-based living. Feminists and queer organizers, including movements like CAFRA, built networks of care and political resistance, asserting not just the right to survive, but to define the terms of life itself. The era was also sparked by a resurgence in Caribbean cultural expression, including the founding of Burning Flames in Antigua in 1985. And while there's a lot to critique about the strategies of the time, including in Grenada, what I want to point out here is that people then imagined another way. Material achievements coupled with ideological work of feminist and liberation politics positioned Grenada, for example, as a model of reimagining Caribbean resistance and transformation. Yet, the revolution was ultimately unsustainable in the face of Western interference. We know what happened next. In 1983, the United States invaded Grenada, just as it had earlier undermined Jamaica's social democratic system. This time, it didn't just destabilize, it used military force to crush the idea of a sovereign, anti-capitalist Caribbean future. These acts of imperial repression were strategic, not only to punish, but to extinguish the possibility of imagining otherwise. What followed was a wave of structural adjustment, IMF austerity, and trade liberalization. The policies gutted public services, deepened inequality, and locked Caribbean nations into cycles of dependency. Caribbean economies became subordinated to Western markets, their sovereignty hollowed out. As Wendy Grenade puts it, the region entered a state of permanent structural vulnerability. This economic subjugation extended beyond markets. It shaped cultural and identity. Western ideologies reinforced sexism, homophobia, and racial division. Feminist movements were sidelined, and care work was further devalued. Structural adjustment pushed the burden of survival onto women, who were expected to fill the gaps left by the gutted social services at the cost of their health and their children's well-being. These anti-caring, anti-humanizing measures heightened gender and racial tensions, particularly in places like Guyana and Trinidad, where colonial labor divisions persist. Neoliberalism also ravaged the environment. Mangroves replaced by resorts, reefs bleached by cruise ships, and landscapes reshaped by tourism and exports. Under the guise of development, the Caribbean became more vulnerable to storms, debt, and displacement. And yet, the Grenada Revolution endures as a bold, if brief, realization of a different path. Sovereign, feminist, ecological, and people-centered. Its defeat devastated regional morale, but its vision still speaks to the present. That moment was not isolated. It was part of a wider Caribbean tradition of resistance. Figures like Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Claudia Jones wove together Black liberation, feminism, and transnational struggle. Today, they remind us that ruptures also open space for liberation, for rebellion, and for reinvention, and imagining otherwise futures. Neoliberalism's grip on our imagination continues to persist. We are now living in a period of late-stage capitalism where climate catastrophe intensifies, wealth consolidates, and resources vanish, disproportionately impacting the most financially precarious. These overlapping crises deepen social fractures seeded by colonial ideologies. Queer people are seen as a threat, and scarcity-driven by austerity fuels racial, gendered, and class divisions. In places like Belize, Suriname, and Guyana, extractive industries clash with indigenous rights. Haiti, hardest hit by climate change, lays bare the colonial costs we still pay while the North profits. This rupture has also driven migration. In partnership with Dr. Natasha Mortley at the IGDS Regional Unit, I have studied the gender toll, with women increasingly pushed into informal sectors like domestic work, sex work, micro-trade, often migrating across borders without documentation or protection. These precarious livelihoods do not replace the community loss or the emotional and economic devastation left behind, nor do remittances undo the conflicts they spark between sending and receiving communities. Caribbean governments, still entangled in old dependencies, turn to offshore finance to grow their economies. But this brings new vulnerabilities: shell banks and speculative investments, from Turks and Caicos to Antigua, from Puerto Rico's post-hurricane crypto colonialism and the land grab in Barbuda to Haiti's collapse. We see how financial freedom for the few comes at deep social costs. This third rupture has also fueled gun violence, domestic abuse, and a response of increased state violence. Yet, despite this, Caribbean people have not been still. Even in the face of what seems like insurmountable odds, the region continues to resist, organize, and imagine. Take, for example, in 2009, Guadeloupe witnessed a historic 44-day general strike led by a coalition of 48 organizations, from unions to cultural groups, winning 165 demands, including wage increases and lower utility prices. The uprising spread to Martinique, where similar victories followed. At the same time, feminist, queer, and trans justice movements rooted in anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist ethics have grown. Yet these developments face co-optation. As David Scott warns, gender has become a development buzzword, entangling activism in donor-driven NGO culture that manage poverty rather than dismantle it. This NGOization, especially in Haiti, where over 80% of the public services are outsourced, represents a new form of colonial control. It replaces state responsibility with foreign funding and subcontracted sovereignty. In addition, the US conservative agenda, Project 2025, escalates these threats, leaving the Caribbean to figure out the impacts of imperialist policies will have. And yet each rupture is also a portal, a chance to build something new. As Sir Arthur Lewis taught, people, not profits, drive transformation. Equity is as important as efficiency, and sustainable futures must center justice. In the face of today's crisis, we must not collapse under the weight of pessimism. We must draw strength from our own history, learning from past failures, yes, but also from the courage of those who rose against seemingly immovable systems. We have always fought. We have always imagined. Like C.L.R. James, I call on us to reclaim the idea of a Caribbean nation, a self-determined, united region, imagining its own future. In 1968, Walter Rodney warned that each victory of the Caribbean working class is too often co-opted, forcing new struggle in the pursuit of true liberation. That pattern continues. And so the question becomes, what can we imagine and work toward now? The reimagining I offer here takes its point of departure from Sir Arthur Lewis's influential dual sector model. Introduced in 1954, the model conceptualizes developing economies as comprising two distinct sectors: a traditional agricultural sector with surplus labor and a modern industrial sector marked by higher productivity. Lewis proposed that economic transformation could occur by gradually shifting labor from agriculture to industry through modest wage incentives, fueling growth, reinvestment, and broader development. Though the model has faced significant critique, It remains a landmark contribution and a generative foundation for thinking about economic transition. And so today, in this moment of rupture, I ask, what kind of model might serve now? To answer this, I turn to inherited structures, not to inherited structures, but to ecological and social rhythms already alive in the Caribbean. I've drawn not from Western capitalism's notions of interdependence, but from the relational logics of our waters, our coastlines, and our communities. I've tried to think expansively, to imagine an economy rooted in care, in memory, and survival, not just productivity. I offer this reimagining in the spirit of Lewis's own words about the collective judgment of new ideas and his insistence that progress depends on the freedom to back one's own judgment, even in the face of disapproval. As someone outside of the discipline of economics, I understand that not everyone will agree with what I propose. Still, I make this offering. On a balmy early afternoon in June 2021, I was on a small motorboat making my way from Belize to St. George's Key, a small islet off the coast of the mainland, to attend a 7-day feminist writing retreat. As we zipped across the salt water, I was amazed at how full of vegetation it was. Having grown up in Barbados, I am accustomed to the Caribbean waters, crystal clear and pristine, so transparent that you could see way down deep into its depths. When I arrived at the islet, I was a bit disappointed. While the space was beautiful, the waters immediately surrounding the shores were much the same as the ones we had just crossed. Not crystal clear with visible white-pink sand through which I could see my toes sinking into the bottom, but full of vegetation, such that it was hard to see anything at all, and it was also a bit smelly. I immediately thought of the 5 swimsuits I had packed for this trip and felt my excitement and anticipation of relaxing on the beach dissipate. This water was so different to what I was accustomed, and instead of engaging with this difference, I held on to my singular perspective of what it should be. I was steadfast in my refusal to venture into it and to swim. I share my experience because despite my refusal to immerse myself in the water, during that entire trip, I remained intrigued by it. I thought I knew what Caribbean waters were supposed to look like, but clearly I did not. So I began asking questions. Why did this island off the coast of Belize not have a beach or what I thought were the typical turquoise waters which gently rolled on and off the Caribbean island shores? I learned from the marine biology, ecology, and geology literature it was because they were brackish. Brackish is a term I had heard before when I visited Montego Bay, Jamaica, and toured the luminous lagoon at sunset. The lagoon is home to dinoflagellates, naturally occurring bioluminescent organisms that thrive where salt and fresh water combine and light up when you touch the water. When I visited the lagoon years before my trip to Belize, I was captivated by the eerie light glow that was left in the wake of the boat as we made our way to a spot where we could swim. As my friends immersed themselves and splashed around in the water, I did not swim then either. The scene seemed almost magical. And yet, as with my trip to Belize, the scene was outside of what I understood and consequently could imagine about the Caribbean waterscape and the life found therein. Brackish water forms where fresh water and salt water meet, creating a narrow dynamic zone of lower salinity than the open ocean. Found in estuaries, mangroves, marshes, and coastal lakes, the salinity in brackish zones range from 0.5 grams per liter to 30 grams per liter, such that brackish water is not fixed and shifts over time and space. The density difference between fresh and salt water means that when these two bodies meet, the lighter fresh water rises up and over the denser salt water. For estuaries, this mixing process occurs through what is called estuarine circulation. Often this occurs at an abrupt salt front, where the salt content or salinity and density may change from oceanic to fresh in just a few tenths of meters horizontally and as little as a meter vertically. Accompanying these strong salinity and density gradients are large vertical changes in current, direction, and strength. When the velocity difference reaches a certain threshold, vigorous turbulence results, and the salt and fresh water are mixed. The harshness of the mixing is what I want you to pay attention to. This makes brackish waters uninhabitable to a number of species that exist solely in fresh or saltwater spaces. Non-brackish adapted organisms find it unpleasant and they find it distasteful, but the harsh brackish conditions also fuel some of the most productive ecosystem on Earth and also some of the most vulnerable. The brackish waters of Jamaica's Luminous Lagoon and those around St. George's Key in Belize emerge from distinct ecologies. In Jamaica, where the Martha Brae River meets the sea, warm shallows glow with bioluminescent life layered with histories of colonial trade. In Belize, ocean sandbars enclose dense vegetation-filled waters, murky and vibrantly alive. Neither landscape fits the postcard vision of the Caribbean's transparent turquoise sea, and yet both embody a different kind of beauty where harsh conditions give rise to extraordinary ecosystems. They create the conditions not just for life, but life lived differently. Both waterscapes are also home to mangroves, brackish-rooted forests that resist colonized imaginaries of paradise. In St. George's Key, the mangrove reserve shelters endangered manatees and anchors a delicate ecological balance. In Caribbean literature, such as Maurice Conde's Crossing the Mangrove, these zones are portrayed as mysterious, resistant, and essential. Their tangle roots speak to both survival and entanglements of Caribbean identity. Confronting the waters of St. George's Key challenged what I thought I knew about my region. That moment sparked questions. What might brackish waters teach us about the Caribbean? About futures shaped not by clarity and conquest, but by adaptation, relation, and refusal. Brackish waters show that abundance often emerges from struggles. They model not purity or perfection, but creative mixing. As a metaphor, brackish becomes a way of thinking, sensing, and imagining. It resists the linear extractive logics of Western colonialism and offers instead an ethic of care, an embrace of the in-between, and a model for reimagining the Caribbean as a site of radical possibility. Here, brackish is doing layered work. It mirrors the turbulent push and pull of Caribbean people, what they have endured through a history of turbulent rupture. We have long been required to adapt, but this moment asks for more than adaptation or critique. It demands reimagination, a refusal of what Catherine McKittrick calls a linear progression toward death. It challenges us to imagine how we might hold on to life, human and non-human, beyond quantification and extractive monetized global systems. Kevin Kwashi speaks of aliveness as an ethical orientation in a world that is unethically oriented. Building on this, I argue that we must imagine beyond neoliberal capital as a metric of progress. Neoliberalism hasn't just weakened our economies, it has eroded our values, dismantled local industries, and replaced sufficiency with dependency. Free trade was never free. It cost us sovereignty, sustainability, and collective dignity. This path was not chosen. We were conscripted into a global order designed to extract, not to sustain. It's cruel. Its cruelty is not theoretical. We are living its consequences. So, what might a different orientation look like? What if our organizing logics are not about surviving capitalism, but about building lives shaped by care, relation, and mutuality? What can we learn from the living non-human world, its capacity to adapt, regenerate, and thrive in unstable conditions? I offer a different model. I call this brackish economies. A model that draws from Caribbean ecology and culture to imagine otherwise. It is rooted in Sylvia Wynter's notion of the frontier zone, a counter space beyond dominant European logics, where alternative meanings and forms of life take root. Brackish economies help us name the harsh conditions we navigate without surrendering to despair and without collapsing our stories into simplified tales of resilience. Like Kwashi and McKittrick, I'm interested in the creative, adaptive ways people generate meaning in systems designed to erase them. Brackish is both metaphor, method, and a model. Repositions the Caribbean from a zone of damage to a site of becoming. We do not have to accept, as Winter writes, our imposed liminal status within the global order. Even within liminality, we make life. The core principles of brackish economies, as I stated earlier, build on and extend Lewis's dual sector model. But rather than positioning labor and capital as oppositional forces, or emphasize linear progression, accumulation, and the absorption of excess labor into formalized industry, my model reframes labor, identity, and ecology as entangled and co-constitutive, deeply informed by Caribbean histories and essential to Caribbean futures. Brackish economy retains Lewis's focus on labor as central to the transformation, but reimagines its definition and significance. Rather than seeing labor only as factory or agricultural output, it expands the frame to include informal work, care work, queer labor, ecological tending, and embodied resistance. Where Lewis spoke of surplus labor, brackish economies ask a critical question: surplus to whom? What is deemed excessive under colonial capitalist logics may, in fact, be essential to community survival. The model rejects traditional metrics of productivity and instead embraces a more expansive relational understanding of economic value. This orientation also brings care to the forefront, not as residual category, but as a vital economic infrastructure. Feminized, kin-based, and queer forms of care are recognized as anchors to Caribbean life. The model centers labor that is often made invisible by racial, gendered, and colonial frameworks, arguing that these forms of labor sustain not just households, but entire communities. Brackish economies also reclaims the Caribbean as a site of innovation, not as a place lagging behind modernity, but as a space of creative adaptation. While Lewis rooted his analysis in the plantation and colonial economy, brackish economies looks at the post-plantation landscape and sees an enduring legacy of ingenuity under constraint. Rather than separating tradition and modern, it understands the region's economic life as inherently hybrid, dynamic, improvisational, and shaped by complex flows of people, goods, and ideas. The model further breaks from binary thinking. Lewis structured his theory around oppositions: traditional versus modern, formal versus informal, rural versus urban. Brackish economies replaces this with a framework of fluid entanglement. Caribbean economies, like brackish waters, resist clean separation. They mix and churn, blending categories and disrupting fixed boundaries. Instead of transition, the brackish model envisions transforming through mixing, seeing in the in-between a space of creativity, generativity, and necessity. In this way, brackish economies offers not just an economic theory, but a conceptual orientation. It mirrors the region's ecological complexity, cultural hybridity, and political history. It provides a method of imagining Caribbean futures not tethered to extractive growth, but to mutual care, collective well-being, and radical redefinition. It insists that Caribbean survival is not about moving towards someone else's vision of progress, but about thriving through our own adaptive, generative possibilities. Brackish economies is a queer economic model, both in theory and in practice. It queers how we understand economies by challenging the dominance of GDP and growth as singular measures of value. It also foregrounds how queer, trans, and non-normative bodies live, labor, and shape economic space. This model makes value visible what is often erased: sex work, mutual aid, informal and care economies, performance labor, and other forms of survival and creativity born in conditions of abandonment. Take queer labor in the Caribbean, for example. As queer tourism destination weddings, pride cruises, luxury experiences expands, the state profits from these pink economies. Yet, this visibility is uneven. Queer people may be welcome into wealthy districts to perform labor that fuels the state's image and income, while colonial laws and moral ideologies deny them protection. Many are disowned by their families, pushed into informal networks where care is exchanged in the shadows, in the gullies, in the drains, and precarious housing. Queer organizations like ECAID, for example, step in to fill the gap. Their labor is often unrecognized by the state, but vital to the life of the community. At its core, brackish economies is an ethic of memory and refusal. It draws inspiration from swamps, mangroves, and estuaries, not just as ecological formations, but as metaphors of resistance and thriving. These are environments that evade capture, that preserve histories of struggle and adaptation. They are messy, fertile spaces where the inherited order of plantation begins to dissolve in something new, something relational, uncertain, and alive. Brackish economies doesn't seek to resolve contradiction, it sits with it. It doesn't sanitize the realities of exploitation or offer easy solution. Instead, it insists that in the tension between visibility and violence, survival and abandonment, a different way of organizing economic life is already emerging. It is also an economic model that works with slowness, refracted through Caribbean rhythms like liming and partying and resting and resisting urgency. It aims for slowed economies that redistribute not just wealth, but time and breath. It demonstrates that the Caribbean is a threshold space, a generative space. There's never been a clean movement from traditional to modern. Our history tells us so. Brackish economies acknowledge the messy, interwoven, racialized, gendered, and ecological entanglements that have always shaped Caribbean life. The question then becomes, how do we realize brackish economies? I theorize that it requires us to do several things, from reimagining the world we want to see through embracing joy, each of which I will briefly discuss before closing. We achieve brackish economies first by reimagining the world we want to see. As Andrea reminds us, this act of imagination begins not with rigid ideologies, but with new language, a language that centers the relationship among people and affirms caring labor not as peripheral, but as essential to building a just world. The estuarine circulation I mentioned earlier that sustains life in the brackish waters is not unlike the currents of care, creativity, and resistance that sustains life in the Caribbean. They are the root of our most innovative economic activity, not GDP figures, but in our food systems, kinship structures, rituals, mutual aid networks, and cultural productions. We must not mistake survival for economic thriving. Survival is a minimum. Thriving is the horizon. Individual Caribbean people embody this every day. This also means reimagining something beyond resilience. The rhetoric of resilience often masks the violence we are expected to endure. I'm not interested in addressing resilience, at least not in the way that it has been used to caricature Caribbean people, particularly Caribbean women, viewed as strong matriarchs who sacrifice everything for her children amidst the backdrop of what Tracy Robertson writes is a cruel joke of enjoying economic independence, as the household she heads is likely to be among the poorest in the nation. The rhetoric of resilience is used to exploit our natural environments and to prop up the violence living beings experience, which is caused by a lack of access to resources, care, and extractive concepts of oppressed people as superhuman, living non-human beings as bountiful and here for our sole use and purpose, because it is thought that we can handle any and all adverse situations. In my mind, this resilience narrative stifles imagination. Resilience says, keep going, but I ask, to what end? Reimagining the Caribbean future also means making space for queerness, for disability, for the undocumented and others. It means climate justice rooted in land and water sovereignty, not green capitalism. Brackish spaces Swamps, mangroves are often maligned. In colonial logics, they are to be drained, cleared, and developed. But this ecosystem holds life. They are rich in biodiversity. They protect shorelines from erosion. They are places of regeneration and incubation. They teach us that survival does not always come in straight lines, that the most fertile spaces can be the murkiest, that clarity is not a prerequisite for growth. In fact, brackish economies draw on the concept of degrowth, in that it envisions alternative political and economic actions that improve human well-being and respect ecological limits. Second, we prioritize community just as different species of brackish adapted organisms arrived from various geographies and evolved to survive turbulent waters. So too must Caribbean people coming from different histories, identities, and places learn to live and grow together. In brackish economies, community becomes the measure of what is stable, ethical, and alive. It means we listen more deeply, we more intentionally, and we fight together. Prioritizing community also means confronting the ruptures that divide us. It requires acknowledging the internal violence that racial, class, gendered, and colonial hierarchies have inflicted. In Guyana, for example, the racialized violence of the 1960s still haunts the present. A rupture deepened by silences around how women and children experienced that violence, how it was endured, remembered, and passed down. The memory of this rupture lingers, and to imagine brackish futures, we must attend to these wounds. We can look to the mangrove as our teacher. A quintessential brackish space, the mangrove thrives in instability. It does not resist the tide by standing firm. It survives by bending. It filters salt. It shelters lives. It gives generously of itself, not to wall off danger, but to create space for protection, for incubation, for rest. The mangrove teaches us that survival is not a solitary act. It is relational, it is communal, it is rhizomatic, spreading across and through difference. This is the essence of community in the brackish model, building life not despite difference, but through it. Third, we must find creative ways to build as we struggle. Brackish economies are where futures gestate in the mess of the now. They do not wait for ideal conditions. They emerge precisely in the midst of uncertainty, crisis, and constraint. History reminds us that creativity has always been part of Caribbean life. For centuries, the Caribbean has not operated solely through formal markets. Our economies have always been rich with informality, caregiving, bartering, spiritual exchange, rotating credit associations, susus, meet interns, my sister's in one right now, cooperative societies, diaspora remittances, community land tenure. These are not marginal, they are foundational, and they have been sustained largely by women. What if we centered these modes of survival, not as nostalgic artifacts, but as blueprints for economic transformation? What if instead of growth at all costs, we modeled our economies on the mangrove, flexible, rooted, cooperative? We already see this creativity in how Caribbean people are responding to climate crisis. Since 2011, sargassum seaweed has been washing up on Caribbean shores in massive quantities, threatening marine life and coastal livelihoods. And since 2011, Caribbean people have been trying to figure out creative ways to transform this ecological disruption into opportunity. Davian Morrison in Jamaica, for example, is turning seaweed into animal feed and eco-friendly charcoal alternatives, arguing that such innovations can save forests while offering clean, sustainable energy. At the regional level, this creative energy is visible in policy innovations like the Bridgetown Initiative, championed by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley. In response to the intertwined crises of debt, climate, and vulnerability, the global inequality, Mottley has called for a radical restructuring of global financial systems. The Bridgetown Initiative reflects a brackish approach to global politics, vulnerable, adaptive, and willing to break from inherited models. However, even though the Bridgetown Initiative is creative and crucial to getting us to another place, it relies on the benevolence of the West. It still exists within a framework that assumes Western powers have the capacity or willingness to act justly and to swim toward us and be adapted. Motley's Bridgetown initiative may open space for rethinking global financial structures, but it doesn't guarantee change, especially when Western nations are still at the head of the negotiating table. In this context, we are reminded of the limits of Western aid and frameworks. The Caribbean nations must think about their own sovereignty and solidarity in ways that do not wait for the West to act. Brackish economies, therefore, are beyond Bridgetown, beyond Kingston, beyond Georgetown, and St. John's. The brackish vision must be regional, connecting across the Caribbean. It requires a commitment to the interconnectedness of our genealogies and our histories and our futures, all of which are deeply intertwined. This connection demands that we create a model that extends beyond nationalism. The Grenada Revolution stands as a powerful testament to the possibilities of regional solidarity. Grenada, according to George Lamin, offers a glimpse of the Caribbean future where the region was in a moment of resistance. Renewed regionalism offers a path towards collective strategies for climate adaptation, gender equity, and economic transformation that can move us toward a more just and brackish future. In addition, brackish economies also calls to deepen South-South cooperation. The Caribbean, like many nations across the so-called global South, shares a history of colonial extraction and faces the compounded crises of climate change and economic marginalization. In this context, regional autonomy must be matched with global solidarity by learning from each other's innovations in eco-entrepreneurship, land stewardship, and grassroots climate adaptation. Finally, the Caribbean's economic models cannot just be about survival. They must forecast thriving. This is where the metaphor of brackish economies becomes so powerful. Finding aliveness in the in-between, the messy, the unpredictable. This is not about a passive resilience, but that simply waits for external change. It is an active, vibrant space of creation, of living through art, culture, and joy. Whether through national celebrations like Crop Over or in everyday acts of cultural creativity, the Caribbean proves that survival does not have to come at the expense of living well. These celebrations of life, even amidst ongoing struggles, form the heart of Caribbean's radical imagination, a refusal to be defined solely by hardship, but instead to define new possibilities from the rubble of the old system. In thinking about the Caribbean's future, the challenge is not just about survival, but about defining what it means to live well. And this extends beyond the capitalist centers of power. This is my call to action. The brackish is not a utopian fantasy. It is layered with sediment, history, and ache. But it also shimmers with phosphorescence possibility, revealing its potential also in the dark. This is the Caribbean experience, not simply survival, but illumination. We are not post-catastrophe. We are mid-mixing. We live in a region shaped by rupture, where salt and fresh meet, where turbulence becomes architecture. This moment demands that we move beyond economic determinism toward a model centering on thriving. This means rejecting GDP as our sole measure of value and building economies grounded in care and ecological well-being. The Caribbean, with its histories of resistance and its traditions of sufficiency and solidarity, offer a powerful alternative to the logic of global capitalism. Fanon reminds us that we are not bound by history, we are its authors. This is the spirit of brackish economies, a refusal of mimicry, an embrace of radical reimagination. In this way, the Caribbean is not a warning, it is a guide, a conductor of new frequencies. Through rituals, rebellions, and rhythms, Caribbean people have long practiced futurity. We know how to cultivate possibility from contradiction. And so to move forward, brackish economies is to choose a future shaped not by extraction, but by obligation to each other, to the earth, and to the yet to come. This is not a crisis zone, but a way of knowing and being. And so as Burning Flames urges us, let's swing the engine. Let's rev toward a future that doesn't wait for Western validation, but is already alive in the strength of our communities. This is the architecture of brackish, alive, entangled, and full of promise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baldwin, for that thought-provoking and insightful lecture. Put your hands again. Put your hands together for her again. Indeed, she has highlighted 3 epochal ruptures that Caribbean societies have experienced: the colonialism and genocide rupture, neoliberalism, climate collapse. And she went as far as to show us how creativity and resilience can emerge from these ruptures. Then Dr. Baldwin offered us several recommendations in a number of frameworks, including the framework of Sir Arthur Lewis's dual sector model, and then the brackish economies. And one of the things I heard coming out of her lecture is the importance of supporting the inclusion of marginalized and vulnerable groups. Thank you so much, Dr. Baldwin. Now to the very interesting and this is a segment where we invite questions for our distinguished speaker. But while you think about those questions, permit me, if you may, to just, recognize and thank Professor Justice Robinson, principal of the UE 5 Islands campus, Dr. Camille Samuel, campus registrar, for your kind hospitality. I don't know if Dr. Sukram is here, but I also acknowledge you, Dr. Sukram, Director of SALISES St. Augustine. Thank you so much. All right, so without further ado, we invite online viewers. I believe you can post your questions, but we also invite members of the audience to pose questions to Dr. Baldwin. Please, if you have any questions, you can approach the mic, and then we'll take a round of maybe 4 questions and then allow Dr. Baldwin to respond. Okay, you can probably write on the back. All right, so I'll start with a question. Dr. Baldwin, you spoke a lot about, the importance of equity and equality. Can you just elaborate a bit more for us on how you see gender equality being one of the ways in which we can overcome, you spoke about the importance of rebellion and resistance, spaces of adaptation. What role do you see gender equality playing in that respect?
Hi again. I'm going to answer that question by invoking Danielle Bob. Danielle gave a presentation today in her panel that really spoke to why we need to include gender in the ways that we're thinking about value in our economies. And the reason is because, like I mentioned in my talk too, women have been the people who have been doing the work that keeps our societies and our economies going, but their work, especially their care work that is usually not paid or undervalued. Women who are working in care industries, they're not making, we're not centering those things, and those are the things that keep our economies going. And so for me, the brackish model shows that if we're just talking about what is visible in our economic models, we can't keep going with those models, because the models aren't showing the engine. I invoked burning flames, like the engine behind the economy are the women who are doing the labor so other people can, for themselves and their families, but then also so other economic parts of society can run. And so gender has to be squarely in the center of whatever we're going to do going forward. Like I said, I put forth brackish as a model. It is very, very messy, but I think that if we're thinking linearly and we are continuing to think like we've been thinking in this way that just prioritizes numbers and prioritizes financialization, that we're not going to get out of the rut that we're in. And so gender has to be a part of recognizing who is doing the work that allows the economy to run the way that it runs. So I think gender has to be at the forefront and in the center.
Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Baldwin. Do we have any other questions for Dr. Baldwin? Any comments? Thank you so much, Dr. Nortovo.
Everyone, fascinating concept, brackish economy, building on creolization thesis, essentially. I like the comment you made about avoiding mimicry, because I think that's perhaps the central tension within brackish economies, is where you're adaptive, but you're adaptive against a standard that requires some amount of almost self-mutilation. You're fitting yourself within certain spaces, but you're also being hurt by them. And I think sometimes in our pursuit for development, we are also looking at models which are undermining our development. So we have a wonderful Antigua, brilliant, but almost a intensity of development that is undermining the sustainability of its ecosystems and of its communities in the long run. What is the role of the university, do you think, in decolonizing our mindscapes? The role of the university in rethinking the ways in which we bring science to the solutions, and the role of the university in rethinking the practices and policies that we are trying to implement towards getting towards a higher level of well-being. So you didn't use the word decolonization strongly, but you know there's a strong movement in terms of the decoloniality project. So what role do you think the university should play in all of this to get to the brackish economy?
All right, so we're going to take the question from Dr. Natalie Dietrich-Jones, and then we have a question online, and then we'll allow Dr. Baldwin to respond.
Okay, good night. Thanks so much for the lecture. I'm intrigued by this idea of the brackish economy and just trying to sort through in my mind what it would look like in the future, a future Caribbean. So maybe two questions. One is very high unemployment rates among youth in the region. How does the brackish economy address this issue? I guess surplus labor in a way, but not in the way that Lewis would have defined it. And then the second thing is, I don't think it was explicit, but I'm interpreting a retreat from the traditional trading system. That's how I'm seeing what you said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But what are the products, if any, that we're exporting or producing, and where will they go, if not to the traditional trading partners that we currently engage with?
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And so we have a question online. So the question is, in light of the rising neoconservatism in the global north and the issues we are seeing in the US, is the Caribbean ready to lead such a radical shift in values?
I think everybody's going to be vexed with me now for this answer, because I'm going to answer all at once. And that is, the lecture is entitled Reimagining for a reason. It is provocative to ask. I'm asking us to think outside of what is the status quo. Brackish might not work, right? It is my thinking, like, what else can we do? Because what we have been doing is not working. So I don't know the answer to what are the products and the outputs. But I know that in the Caribbean, the models that have been imposed on us from outside have not been working, and we have been making do with other models. And so for me, why can't we look at those things that we have been doing to survive? Like I said, my sister is in a meet intern, right? This is how we have been doing things, at least in Barbados, for a while. And so the answer is, can we just think about it? Can we just think about something different? Can we just imagine something that might seem really radical in terms of like pulling from the water to think about what economies could look like? But what we're doing is not working. And so that's why I say the answer is going to be frustrating, because I think we need to sit, instead of thinking about the outputs at this moment, we need to sit with the imagination. We need to sit with what are some things that could be different if we thought outside of the imposed system that we are in right now. So don't be vexed with me for that answer, but that's the answer that I have.
Okay, we have a question from our principal. And I think we have time for 2 additional questions, and then Dr. Baldwin will make the final intervention. Go ahead, Principal.
I'm not sure if I need to thank you because you have my head turned, as we would say in Barbuda. I don't so much have a question, but maybe just trying to clarify if I'm getting you correctly. I was sort of making some notes. I like the concept. I see it as a sort of nuanced perspective on economic transition. So I just want to get maybe 2 quick points of clarity in terms of my interpretation. So Lewis seems to assume that labor will seamlessly move from traditional to modern sectors. And I get that, and I want to make sure I get that you're suggesting that labor can get stuck in informal sectors, gig economies that aren't clearly traditional or modern. And I just want to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly. So I think the model is important, and I think we should incorporate it a little more into our traditional discussion, because my interpretation is that you are kind of identifying some real-world frictions that the Lewis model sort of idealizes away. So I think it's a very important contribution and very useful. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please. Yes.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Baldwin, for sharing quite a mind-jarring concept. It's definitely made me think, but this is maybe not a question, but I'll share a bit about what is provoked in me. I think brackish is necessary for us as Caribbean people right now. I hope many in the audience will agree with me if I say that our economies are under attack as I speak. Anybody familiar with what's happening in shipping? So there's been a proposal that any Chinese ship leaving this region, landing in the US market, will pay $1 million tariff. That's on top of the 10% you talked about, all right? So when I think about maybe what this could become, I think about the fact that you mentioned the gentleman in Jamaica who's producing fertilizer. Can I find it in Antigua? Can I find it in St. Vincent? Probably not. There's a lot of work for us to do in, I would say, breaking our dependency. And I think there's been a clear shot across our bow that says we need to no longer completely depend on some of those traditional powers that be, because you take it back all the way to the colonial times. And might I suggest that we've traded one master for another? And so when I think about what it means to be brackish, my thought process goes, how do we protect our, not just economic well-being, but our social, our families, our livelihoods, which you mentioned all of those things. And what does that actually look like for us as a Caribbean? Not as one singular nation, as all these flags represent us all on stage. So just wanted to share some of the things that it evoked from me.
Dr. Baldwin, thank you for a very engaging lecture. And I have to say that it's a pity that during the lecture I had to leave the hall for quite a few minutes to take an important call from Trinidad. But coming back and listening to what you were saying, it left me thinking about what we do in the academy when we discuss and engage with theories. And I think, your lecture does bring to the fore a kind of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary take, which, as we sit here, each of us has our own disciplinary persuasion, and sometimes we are, a bit dogmatic about what we bring to the table in keeping with our disciplinary persuasion, to the point that we lock off, other influences coming from other disciplines, or even within the disciplines, to the extent that it is challenging what we know. And I think, as I listen to you, the best intellectual for me is the one that I often tell my students, I'm a statistician. And the first thing I do is write the word statistics on the board. And I say, if you know everything you need to know in statistics, you would be at the end of the last S. But I start at the beginning of the first S, and I do like this, and I said, that's where I am, and that's where perhaps the majority of those who engage as statisticians will be, because there's so much more that we need to understand and learn. And this brings me to the point about, conferences, the conferences that we have. And oftentimes we are speaking to one another. A lot of times we open it up, we create opportunities for the public to be part of the discussion, but when you have fees, registration fees, that precludes their participation. And I think in response to perhaps the question the issue Dr. Notova raised, and I know it has been done in the university setting already. I think, it is high time beyond these conferences, we actually use our own individual intuition and go out there in the communities. As a friend of mine would say, these are the kinds of opportunities where gong meets town, so to speak. And we have to go out there in the communities, because I am convinced, and even while I was at the university, I always felt that there are people out there who we may really think, what can they bring to the table? But there's so much to learn from the fisherman who might come to one of your outreach initiatives in a little cottage meeting in a community center. And I think more and more we have to do that and document what we are hearing from these people as well, because that to me is where the practical element of what you are talking about and the idea you are enunciating, that's to me the forum where it could actually be tested and work. So that's my take on, actually thinking out of the box about what you were saying, and I really appreciate the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. St. Bernard, for that intervention. And we'll take our last question as entertainment awaits us, right? All right. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baldwin, for a very thought-provoking lecture. It is a discussion to me that is rooted in how do we break the chains and the barriers for which you mentioned George Lamin, and it's about sovereignty of the imagination. It is about that freedom to express while at the same time embracing all those things that help you to survive. So I understand what you're suggesting in terms of care, hope, the role that women would have played through the evolution of Caribbean development, and the radicalism in terms of ideas, putting ideas to action. So I find it really fascinating. Indeed, I think elements coincided with some things and some of my responses to questions asked this morning, because persons appear to me, given the global uncertainties, especially those directly impacting the Caribbean, whether we should genuflect or whether we ought to push back. I am on the side of pushing back. Indeed, some of the greatest criticisms that came to Sir Arthur was the fact that, or overlooked, let me say, the critics suggest that a lot that has been overlooked was the indigeneity, for which Sir Arthur Lewis always pushed, being indigenous certainly in terms of thought, while embracing the external to assist you to overcome the natural hurdles you had within the context of the region. So I think brackish is, it is a concept that actually speaks to the things and the very dynamics and the complexities that we are dealing with for the last 40 years and that we will probably be dealing with the next 50 years. But what it does, it opens a sphere to which we can use our diplomacy. We can use the things that we know have worked for us in terms of the Susu and other things that you mentioned. But at the same point in time, it speaks to addressing in a radical way our notion of our identity and what is meaningful for us to overcome the hurdles. And I embrace it, and I would like to read more and hear more on it. Thank you very much. Impressed, highly impressed.
Thank you, everyone who offered your generous comments. Professor Robinson, I think you were the only one with a question in the last round. And so my response to your question is that yes, and also that it also seeks to not just the flow, the surplus capital, the surplus labor in terms of flow from agriculture to industry and what gets lost and what might not be, what might get trapped, as you said, but also the things that have not been counted before. So I specifically wanted to mention what I'm calling queer labor because that was never counted, right? And that is very important to propping up societies, especially know that the Caribbean is seeing a lot of pink tourism coming here, and we are sidelining and continue to marginalize queer and trans people as we're using their labor to make us money, right? And so the people who are having to do the labor are queer people. So that's another kind of part that we haven't, that is in the mix of the brackish waters that we haven't looked at before. And then other types of labor as well. So yes, and also more. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
And with that said, this brings us to the end of our distinguished lecture. Dr. Baldwin, we want to thank you so much for your excellent delivery. It was thought-provoking. You have introduced to us the construct of the brackish economies, and you have challenged us to learn from our history. You have also shown us in many ways how resilience and a number of various forms of resistances can emerge from the challenges we face as a region. So thank you so very much. And as a thank you gift, we'd like to present you with this token. Of course, it's a modest token, but I mean, so without further ado, I just want to thank you. Do we have a photo? No cameras? No. Okay, we thank everyone for participating in this section. We thank the online viewers. Oh, the registrar is doing us a favor. right, thank you so much. And again, thanks to our principal and campus registrar for, facilitating this. I'll hand over back to Professor Don Marshall. Thank you, Dr. Baldwin.
Thank you very much. And as MC, I'm not allowed to ask questions and not allowed to prolong the discourse. But I was very pleased with what I hear. I know if you take the time to think big. In fact, the failure to go after some big ideas can see you missing out on some creative social science potential. So it's important for us in the Institute and us in the Academy to constantly remind ourselves that our job is really, among other things, is to produce knowledge that sometimes might cut against the grain. And while we may have to take time to reflect on what is required to come up with new constructs, we are always minded to think about the categories of analysis that we use, think about our concepts, relax them sometimes, subject them to critique, but most of all, what I love in the lecture is that she was prepared to roost with authority, and authority coming from intellectuals as well, right? So daring to roost with authority means you would come up with some radical constructs from time to time. So for example, she says, surplus for whom? That was a provocative question raised when looking at Arthur Lewis's surplus labor. I never felt comfortable with the notion of surplus labor in the Caribbean. But hearing her speak about surplus for whom made me start thinking about the modernist fallacy associated with the notion that you only look at labor in two ways: labor employed servicing something, and labor unemployed. And that doesn't fit the Caribbean. That doesn't fit most economies, because there's unpaid labor going on all the time. Unpaid labor in the work, in the home, and I don't want to go on and on. Volunteer work that people do. All this is important for families and communities. And too many of our economists miss this in trying to rehearse the tropes and the theories of classical thinkers. Now, yes, I said my piece. So, forgive me. At this point, I want to say a word about Burning Flames. So, I shift. We gone different now. We going into no brackish sensibilities here. We going the joy that she spoke about, the part that we are supposed to focus on. So Burning Flames started in 1984. 1984. You think about 41 years of a band, and you ask yourself, in the cultural realm, in the economic realm, what businesses have survived 41 years and still remain in popular demand? Think of it. We know that outside of funeral homes, where black businesses thrive in the region, we have to think of our musical icons, though. Seriously. Our musical icons have managed to navigate the tempest that is the marketplace out there, to stay current, to stay relevant, to help us beat off the stress of everyday life. And when we had a conference a few years back, we paid tribute to Crossfire, a band in Barbados. And at that time, they were marking 30 years of being in the business. We come to Antigua and, wow, you have to take a step back. 41 years, still going strong. Put your hands together for the band Burning Flame. I'm going to ask them to come on stage. The Sir Arthur Lewis Institute and the Five Islands campus want to pay a special tribute for your longevity, your creativity, and the difference you've made in the lives of so many who listen to the strains of your music and move to the vibrant rhythms of your creative melodies and talents. And we had this specially made in the form of a flame. And they want to present it. It reads, the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute wishes to congratulate Burning Flames for its sterling contribution to Caribbean music. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the live entertainment that we will, thank you. The live entertainment that we will, and the cocktail session that follows, all represents an attempt to incorporate the vibes of Caribbean music with what we were trying to do here today. So I'm going to ask you to, following their return to their seats, I'm going to invite, of course, our distinguished Governor General and Lady Williams to stand, and you will head out in the required area along with the principal who will escort you, and then we will follow. So please stand, everyone. As you're on your feet, and now I have your attention, and the live audience may remind you of something very special happening at this campus. There's going to be an AI conference on June 22nd and 23rd. The Five Islands campus is the host of this AI conference. We look forward to your participation in that conference. So stand by for more messaging and so on. Thank you very much. And now we shall, beginning with the front row and the Burning Flames posse, we shall follow them into the entertainment area.